So we are learning the Maimer of Basi Ligani from Tafshin Yud Tes, 1959. And to remind everyone that the original Basi Ligani of the Rebbe Rayat had 20 sections. And every year for 20 years, the Rebbe explained another section. And then the Rebbe did that for a second time. And then the Rebbe started a third time. This Maimer is not connected to this year's Yud Shvat, just to clarify for everyone. It's just like sort of foundational points of Hasidic thought. So I thought it'd be a good Maimer to study. So the first ois, the first section of every Basi Ligani Maimer that the Rebbe says after the first one he said, recaps thus far and then keeps going. So the first ois recaps the basic ideas from the first 8 sections of the Rebbe Rayat's Basi Ligani, and then we keep going in the second section, what is going to be the focus of this year being 1959, the 9th section of the Rebbe Rayat's original Basi Ligani. So just recapping these concepts, we know Basi Ligani speaks about how God wants to be here, how originally he was here, and then through the series of 7 major transgressions, he left further and further and further away. Then Abraham came on the scene and brought him back and back and back and back. And then Moshe, who was the 7th of this line of great, great tzaddikim, holy, holy, holy people, very godly people, Moshe did the ultimate job and brought Hashem's presence, back to planet Earth. And what expressed this was the command that God gave Moshe to build a sanctuary, to build a tabernacle. The tabernacle was the first expression of what would potentially be, of course, the first temple, and then we had the second temple, and now we're waiting for the third temple. So it all originates in this tabernacle, in this Mishkan. And we're going to focus in this Maimer, as the Rebbe Rayatz focuses in his Maimer, on a certain aspect of that tabernacle, of the Mishkan, which really, of course, it was a physical structure, and really, of course, ultimately, as the verse says, make for me this tabernacle, and I will dwell in them, that through the tabernacle, through our service, God is going to dwell in every Jew. So what part of the tabernacle are we focusing on? There's a lot of pieces, but the part that the Rebbe has focused on in his Maimer were the planks of wood that were the surrounding structure of the tabernacle. And they were made from atzei shittim, which the English usually translates as acacia wood. And the Rebbe speaks of shittim in its root word, which means turning. There's turning below intellect, what we call shtus, folly, but then there's a turning higher than intellect, also a shtus, but not sub-rational, supra-rational. And then the Rebbe focused from speaking about this idea of the atzei shittim, this wood which represents our turning less than intellect, sub-rational, or serving God supra-rationally. He spoke how this wood was made into what we call krushim. That's the Hebrew term for these planks of wood. And the word krushim is very specific. The word is used because if you jumble those letters, you get 2 other words in Hebrew. One is called sheker, which means falseness, and one is called kesher, which means bonds. And the Rebbe says that the tabernacle represents our service of God, and this wood, the planks of wood of the tabernacle, represent our service of God, which we take the sheker, we take the falsehoods of this world, and we turn them over into kesher, into bonds between us and God. And that's the whole transformation of this world, the transformation of sub-rational to supra-rational. Meaning, every time we transgress, we're being sub-rational. It's crazy to sin. Like, it makes no sense if you think about it logically. I know there's a God. I mean, you don't have to be like very philosophical and deep and spiritual and mystical. I mean, on the most simple, pragmatic level. Do you know there's a God? Yes. Do you believe he's watching you? Yes. Do you believe he has ultimate power? Yes. Do you believe you're doing now something he says no? Yes. Do you believe he can and will punish you? Yes. So what in the world are you doing it for? No, it makes no sense. Our sages say anytime a person sins, a spirit of folly, meaning sub-rational folly, enters him. Because it makes no sense. Every sin is completely irrational. You're completely going under human logic, which people do in many different self-harming things. When we eat things that are bad for us, if a person abuses themselves with cigarettes or alcohol or many other things, it doesn't make sense. I'm harming myself. Why would I hurt myself? Well, at the moment, I'm not letting myself think about it. Right, that's what I mean by sub-rational. So this world has everything that goes against God is sub-rational. And that's the sheker, the falseness of this world. And our job is to turn that around from being below reason to serving God beyond reason. Just serving God, of course, with reason, but not being limited by our reason. To go beyond what's rational and do what God wants, what God needs, what God is asking from us. To serve God in whatever situation unfolds because I'm here to serve God. So with that, from transforming sub-rational to super-rational, we transform the sheker. Again, remember that was one way we jumbled the letters of the word for beams, keresh. We transform the sheker, the falseness of this world, to kesher, to bonds, to connections of the world and God. And that is the overarching service of the tabernacle. So that was, in brief, the first section. We had done this, but it was 2 weeks ago, that's why I wanted to review it, and now we're towards the beginning of the second section. In the second section, we're going to focus on what is coming specifically from the 9th section of this mimer. And, of course, the idea isn't just to give over that 9th section, but to really, the Rebbe is going to develop his innovations in that 9th section. So in the 9th section of the Maimer of the Rebbe Rayatz, of the original Basi Ligani of 1950, the Rebbe Rayatz explains that these krushim that we just developed at length, as we said, keresh, sheker, kesher, and all those ideas, now we're going to take another piece. We're going to take it a step further in developing the spiritual significance of these krushim, of these planks of wood. And these krushim are called oimdim. Oimdim means standing, right? The wood of the tabernacle was not lying down and the wall was built up by plank after plank after plank. No, the planks of wood were standing. They were erect. That's, of course, if we would think of how the tabernacle looked. We all know that's how it looked. All the planks are forming the walls around the tabernacle. As the verse said, make these planks for the tabernacle from atzei shittim, from this acacia wood, oimdim, that the planks are standing, and that's how they form the walls of the Mishkan. Now, oimdim, standing, is like the word, I'm just literally switching 2 letters, amudim. I have oimdim, which means standing, and I have amudim, which of course etymologically is connected, because amudim means pillars. As it says in the Talmud, we're talking about this atzei shittim, this acacia wood, oimdim. They're called standing because they are ma'amidim. They are like these pillars that keep the whole structure erect. That the pillars, the amudim, connect the height of the ceiling to the base of the floor. And with these pillars, that's how the building exists. Just like, of course, we have until today, right? You have those, we call it a foundational wall or whatever, that's keeping the structure standing. If you were doing work in your house or your building, certain walls you could take down. Yeah, they're just dividers. They're nothing. And certain walls don't touch because they're foundational walls. They're keeping the structure erect. So the amudim, these are the pillars that are foundational to whatever this building is we're talking about. They're embedded in the floor, in the very foundation of the building, and they go all the way up to the ceiling of the building. And through them, the building exists. Through them, the building does not collapse. That's what these amudim, these pillars are. Now, in the mimer, in the 9th section of the Rebbe Rayatz's mimer, the Rebbe Rayatz says that these pillars are like the commandments. I'm emphasizing that because that's something the Rebbe is going to focus on. So I'm cueing you in now. The amudim, these krushim, again, we're going from one to the very, very much how the Rebbe does things. We have the krushim, we have these planks of wood, which we now are renaming, so to speak, amudim. Krushim are omdim. Omdim became amudim. So the krushim are these pillars. And the Rebbe Rayatz, in the 9th section of the Maimer of Basi Ligani, says the amudim are like, they are similar to the mitzvahs. They're similar to the commandments. Because commandments are pillars. And why are commandments pillars? Because the commandments are the pillars that are drawing down and connecting the infinity of God to these worlds, which is exactly what, so to speak, the planks of wood are doing in the tabernacle. As we explained, that the planks of wood, we take the sheker, the falseness of this world, and instead of being sub-rational, we're going to be super-rational and serve God beyond any limits. And we're making the sheker, the falseness of the world, a kesher, a bond between the world and God. So we're drawing God into the world, just like the commandments do, that they draw down from the infinity of God's, or Ein Sof Baruch Hu, from the infinity of God's energy, all the way down into all of the spiritual worlds until actually to our physical world. Now, this concept the Rebbe cites here, the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya. If anyone remembers, it was actually just very, very recently in Tanya. We just did this a few days ago. That the Alter Rebbe explains that the supernal will of God, the Ratan HaElyon, is called Keser. We have the 10 spheros, the 10 divine emanations, and then higher than the 10 spheros, higher than the 10 emanations, we have Keser. Keser means like the crown, which is an expression of the will and pleasure of God. Will is the lower manifestation of Keser, the crown, and pleasure is the higher, deeper, more intimate manifestation of the Keser, of the crown of God, which exists in every spiritual dimension. And generally, when we speak of Keser, we actually speak of Keser in the highest of the 4 spiritual worlds, which is the highest world of Atzilus, of being, within the progression of the 4 spiritual worlds that connect to our physical world. So we have Atzilus, which is the highest of the 4 worlds. We have within there 10 spheros, 10 divine emanations, and higher than the 10, we have Keser, the crown, which is in its external manifestation the supernal will of God, and its inner manifestation God's ultimate pleasure. Because from pleasure, I have a will. I will what I have pleasure in. And from that, evolves into how I think, how I comprehend the world, and then the emotional connections, etc. So this idea, as the Alter Rebbe is explaining here, is that Keser, which the numerical value of Keser is 620, so Keser symbolizes the 620 beams, pillars of light, which means, as the Alter Rebbe explains, the 613 commandments that are biblical, plus the 7 commandments that are rabbinic. So 613 plus 7 is 620. What do we mean by the 7 rabbinic commandments when we know the rabbis added like thousands of commandments? What we mean is most of the commandments of the rabbis are extensions on biblical commandments to support them, to protect them. Like, most famous examples. When the rabbi said you can't eat chicken, well, chicken is not we eat chicken. That chicken is fleischiks. You can't have chicken with milk. Well, why? Well, what does that have to do with anything? It's not an animal that God said was prohibited with milk. Yes, but the rabbi said if a person eats chicken with milk, they'll come to eat meat with milk, because chicken and meat are so similar in how we eat them and how we view them.
So was chicken originally par?
Yes, absolutely.
Because it doesn't nurse its young.
I don't know why, but I know the
It doesn't
facts
nurse
are
its
that
young. That's right.
that could be why.
Because I learned as a kid, thou shalt not bathe thy calf in thy mother's milk. So that's what makes meat, is it's a mammal.
So smart. Wow. Fegachaya, I think you got it. That's really true. And therefore chickens are exempt. And the rabbis said, nope. Just imagine how our life would be so different in our culinary kitchen if the rabbis didn't say that. Why did the rabbis say that? Not to make it harder for us, to make it safer for us. Because since to us, a piece of chicken, a piece of meat are so similar, the rabbi said, if we could eat the chicken with cheese, we might end up eating the meat with cheese as well. So most rabbinic laws are like that. They see our status, they see what we can handle, and if they feel if this is allowed, you're going to end up falling with it, they try to protect us. Like, of course, very famous, the idea of muktzah, items that we're not allowed to move on the Shabbos, because inherently we can't use them on the Shabbos. Meaning biblically, you could pick up a pen, a pencil, all of these items and move them. There's no problem. Just don't write with them. But the rabbi said, no. Once it's written in your hand, it's too likely you're going to end up writing with it. So therefore, we're just going to protect you and not let you touch it and move it at all. You can touch, but you cannot move it at all. So that's 99% of all the laws the rabbis injuncted. But there are 7 that are completely independent, that have nothing to do with any biblical law, like lighting the candles of Hanukkah, for example. So therefore, we say there are 7 rabbinic laws, meaning 7 completely independent rabbinic laws. And 613 biblical plus 7, which we've now explained what I mean by 7 rabbinic, is 620. And 620, not coincidentally, deliberate design, is the numerical value of the word keser. Because keser, we're saying the crown, is the manifestation of God's will. And every commandment is a manifestation of God's will. And there are 620 manifestations of God's will, 613 plus 7. And therefore, God's will, Keser, has numerical value of 620. And therefore, it's brought down that there are 620 pillars of light. And those 620 pillars of light are these 620 commandments. Those are the 620 pillars of light, which is explained, go from the highest height of the superior spiritual worlds all the way down, 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 through all the worlds until they come to our physical reality, all the way down. So just like it says that in this massive structure, you have these very, very strong, tall pillars that are linking, that are connecting, that are establishing from the height of the ceiling all the way down to the floor. So that's what the commandments do. They go to the height of God's supernal will, and they draw that supernal will all the way down, literally to our physical reality. Now, how can I say we're going all the way down to our physical reality? Well, look at the commandments. The commandments are all basically talking about physical things, like we were just talking about pens and cows and chicken. And even if you'll say, well, some commandments are more like spiritual, like loving and fearing God, believing in God, those are pretty spiritual. Souls above do them also. True, but the commandments were given to physical people. There's a physical human being with a human heart and a human body who's loving and fearing God, and a human mind and a human body that's believing in God. So therefore, even those more spiritual commandments are all ultimately physical. So that's what we mean, that the commandments are these pillars of light, these 620 pillars that draw down. Just so you can imagine, every pillar is sort of like hollow in the inside. So they're drawing down through their hollow space the highest of God's supernal will, the Keser of Atzilus, the highest level of the highest world, God's will. And each time you do a commandment through that pillar, God's will comes all the way down through Atzilus to the next world of Bria, the next world of Yitzir, and the next world of Asiya, and within Asiya goes down to the physicality of Asiya, goes down to the physicality of this commandment. That's the commandments. So the commandments are the pillars. So if you remember why we're talking about this, I'll recap just a bit. Shani, we're glad you joined. We are talking about the planks of wood, I'd say shittim, that were the structure of the tabernacle, of the Mishkan. And in the Mimer of the Rebbe Rayatz, he explains that they're called krushim, these planks, because they symbolize our ultimate service of transforming shtus below to shtus above, of transforming from the word keresh, sheker, of this world, to kesher, to a bond between the physicality and God, right? So we have from keresh to sheker, from keresh to kesher. We take the sheker of this world, the falseness of this world, and through our service, instead of being sub-rational, being super-rational in our service of God, we make the falseness of this world to bonds between the infinity of God and the physicality of this world. And then in the 9th section, the Rebbe Rayatz continued that these planks of wood, these krushim, are like the mitzvahs. How did he make a connection between the planks of wood and the mitzvahs? Because in the verse, it says the planks of wood are standing, omdim. And omdim is like amudim, pillars. And the commandments are called pillars. As we just explained through this piece of Tanya from the Alter Rebbe, throughout this mimer, we will reference every one of the Rebbeim, which the Rebbe does in every single Basi Ligani mimer. He references and refers to every Rebbe by name. He doesn't only bring in his Torah, he addresses and references at the Torahs from that Rebbe to bring the Rebbe's energy, every single one of the Rebbeim's energy, into the mimer. Okay, so now we finish this first concept, which was from the Alter Rebbe, how the mitzvahs are like these pillars, which connects to the planks of wood, these krushim of the Mishkan, because they too, as we already explained, are connecting the highest of God's will all the way down to the physicality of this world. Till now, the Rebbe gave over from the Rebbe Rayatz. Now begins the Rebbe's innovation, or the Rebbe's precision, the diyukim, how the Rebbe analyzes the Maimer. And the Rebbe says, you know what? The Rebbe Rayatz, when he brought out this relationship between the mitzvahs, the commandments, and the krushim, these planks of wood, he said the krushim are like the commandments. Now, the fact that he said that, al derech ha-mitzvahs, means that they're not exactly the same. There must be a difference between the symbolism of the krushim, the planks of wood, and the symbolism of the mitzvahs, of the commandments, because otherwise the Rebbe Rayatz wouldn't have said al derech, similar to. He would have said the krushim are the mitzvahs. They both have the same commonality of being these pillars connecting the highest of the height to the lowest of the low. But that's not what he said. He said they're similar to the commandments, which the Rebbe says is very precise. Every word of Torah, every word in the Maimer, every word of the Rebbe Rayatz has impact, has import, has meaning. So the fact that he's saying it's similar means it's not exactly the same. So there must be a difference between the symbolism of these planks of wood, of the krushim, and the spiritual energy of the commandment. Because of that, the Rebbe says, we see when the Rebbe Rayatz is talking about the commandments, he uses a different term than when he's talking about the planks of wood, the krushim. Seemingly he's saying the same thing. Like if I read it, trust me, I would never have noticed. But the Rebbe notices. And the Rebbe says, when the Rebbe Rayatz in the 9th section of the Ma'aser Basi Ligani is talking about what the commandments do, this is what he says. Mamshichim, they draw down, umachabrim, and they join, or in Sof Baruch Hu, the infinity of God's light, v'olamais, and all the worlds. But when the Rebbe Rayatz continues and speaks about the krushim, the planks of wood, he does not use the word mamshichim. He doesn't say they draw down the energy of the Ein Sof. He only says they join. So again, when the Rebbe Rayatz is talking about the mitzvahs, the commandments, he says two things that we could sort of think, oh yeah, it's sort of the exact same thing. But it's not at all. The commandments do two things. They draw down God's infinite light to the world, and they join God's infinite light to the world. When he's talking about the planks of wood, which is not exactly the same, because he said it's similar to, which therefore the Rebbe says means it's not exactly the same. The planks of wood don't draw down the light into the physical world. They join the light with the physical world. What's the significance? We don't know yet, but we see the difference. In order to start analyzing what's the difference and why do the commandments draw down, but the planks of wood don't draw down. They join like the commandments do, but they don't draw down. So in Tanya, when we're speaking of the commandments and comparing them to these pillars, we also see a discrepancy. We also see something that isn't perfectly parallel. Meaning the Rebbe raised one question mark, one lack of parallelism. We said the planks of wood and the commandments, in a sense, have the same spiritual energy. But now we see that it's in a sense, as the Rebbe Rayatz says, because the commandments draw down and fuse God's energy with the world, but the planks of wood don't draw down, they only fuse. So that was one, I'm calling it discrepancy, one question mark. Now that I was going to raise another question mark. We just referenced the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe's work, where the Alter Rebbe, who's not speaking about the krushim there, he's not speaking about the Mishkan, but he's speaking about the commandments, and as I said, it was Achitas of a few days ago, how the commandments are now he set up a similarity between the commandments and pillars in a structure, right? These foundational pillars that connect the highest ceiling to the floor. And so too, the commandments are connecting the highest of God's height, spiritual energy, highest worlds, all the way down to our physical reality. So also there, the Rebbe says, if you look very closely at the wordage of the Tanya, of the Alter Rebbe, when he's speaking about what those physical pillars do, and when he's speaking about what the commandments do, there is something different. It's not exactly the same. Now, what is the difference? Again, this is a very subtle difference. You got to be the Rebbe probably to notice it. But when we're talking about the pillars, we focus on how the pillars are grounded in the floor, in the structure, in the foundation of the building, and from the floor of the building, from the foundational structure of the building, then they ascend all the way to the ceiling to make sure this building does not collapse. And this tall building can stay erect because of these foundational pillars that are cemented in the floor, and from there go all the way to the ceiling. Okay, so what's the difference when we talk about the pillars, meaning the commandments? Because there, again, in the same section of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe is seemingly saying, this equals this, but he switches it. There he says how the commandments are enrooted in the highest height of God's spirituality and descend all the way down, all the way down through all the spiritual worlds until you get literally to planet Earth, to Asiya Gashmis, to the physical manifestation of this spiritual dimension of Asiya, to the physicality of our world. So the Rebbe says, wait a minute. Now there's my second question mark. Why did the Alter Rebbe switch it? Meaning, if I want to say that the pillars and the commandments are one parallel to the other, use the same, I mean, in either case, isn't it sort of the same thing? Both the pillars and the commandments are all the way on the top and all the way on the bottom and connecting and establishing the structure. And I mean, they're doing the same thing. So why did the Alter Rebbe, when he's writing about the physical pillars, choose to focus on them being in the ground and from there ascending up to the ceiling? And when he's talking about the commandments, he says exactly the opposite. How they're rooted in the highest of high and from there go all the way down to this physical world. That's our second question mark. Now we're going to begin by focusing on that second question mark and eventually, of course, get back to answer our first question mark, the difference between the commandments and these krushim, these planks of wood, why the commandments draw down and fuse and the planks of wood fuse but do not draw down. So let's, yeah, we still can keep going. So basically, the Rebbe gives like a cursory, a very brief answer in the end of the second section, and then continues questioning that in the beginning of the third section. So the Rebbe says, well, actually, this concept that the Alter Rebbe is talking about the physical pillars being grounded in the earth, so to speak, in the floor of the building, and the spiritual pillars, the commandments, being grounded in the highest heights of God's energy and come all the way down, makes perfect sense. Why do we know it makes perfect sense? Because it says that there's a very big difference between what's foundational in this physical reality and what's foundational in spiritual realities. Because in our physical reality, the foundation is what's below us, obviously. And what's below us becomes a foundation for everything we build on top of that. But in spiritual realities, the foundation is what's above, because it's a spiritual reality. So it's not below, it's the energy from above. So therefore, in the physical pillars, the stronger element is what's below. So that's why the Alter Rebbe says they're, foundationally implanted in the ground, and then that's where their strength is, and then they ascend all the way to the ceiling. And by the commandments, it says they're sort of enrooted, like foundationally implanted in the highest spiritual energies, because that's where the strength is. And from there, come all the way down to this physical reality. So they said, actually, we don't have any questions. It makes perfect sense why the Alter Rebbe flipped it between physical pillars and the spiritual pillars of the commandment. That's how the Rebbe ends the second section. And then in the third section, the Rebbe questions this. Of course, we didn't think the mimer would be over at this point. And the Rebbe says, but why? Okay, I know it's how it works. I know in a physical reality, the strength is going to be on the bottom. That's where foundations is. Nobody has a foundation for their building in their ceiling. Of course not. Foundations of buildings are on the basement. So, of course, in a physical reality, the strength is going to be on the bottom, in the base, in the ground. That's where your foundation is. And then why is it different than what's above? I mean, in other words, in essence, the Rebbe's question is, the Rebbe doesn't say this, but I'll suggest that our question mark could really be because we know this physical world mirrors God's reality, right? Like we're told, we have kings because God is the king. We generally, most of mankind has always had a 7-day week because God created the world in this random number called 7. So all these very primitive societies, not knowing Torah, somehow create this concept of a 7-day week. So this world mirrors above. So if this world mirrors above, why is this off? You can say, well, it doesn't make any sense. How could you have a foundation in your ceiling? Okay, well, first of all, that's only so because it's so. God could have made it different. But if that so much must be this world, then seemingly that's how it would be above. And in every spiritual reality, the lowest dimension would be the strongest. Like, why not? It sort of makes sense. The malchus of every world, in a sense, is the strongest. I could argue that point. So why are we saying that the physical world does not mirror the spiritual world, even though I thought the physical world is a mirror of the spiritual world? And by the physical reality, the strength is in the bottom, when by the spiritual reality, The strength is in the top. In other words, we said, well, it makes sense that the Alter Rebbe writes it flipped because that's actually how it is between this physical world and the spiritual worlds. And now the Rebbe is saying, but why? Why is there this difference? That our physical world is not in sync, is not mirroring the spiritual world. Why doesn't it work the same in both dimensions? That's the question that we're beginning Ois Gimel, and obviously you could probably sense now we're going to start getting into more deep concepts or what the Rebbe wants to talk about, which are very, very foundational ideas, and that's of course why we want to do this mimer.